Welcome back to part 2 of this dynamic data search box tutorial in Excel. In this part, you will learn how to build dynamic data search boxes for searching and filtering in multiple columns. In part 1 of this tutorial, I already demonstrated how to use the new Excel filter function to create a search box with different search modes that allow you to real-time filter your data as you type, which is already pretty amazing. However, this search box was only able to filter based on one fixed column in your data. And now we're gonna learn some advanced techniques. One that allows you to dynamically select one of multiple columns as your search column with only one click via a drop-down list. The second technique allows you to search through multiple columns at the same time with one search box, so you no longer have to decide to either search in one or the other column. And you will even learn how to include or exclude specific columns via checkboxes. And then finally, the third technique is about introducing one separate search box for each column you want to search in and make them work together through conditional filtering. Before we get started, don't forget to download the worksheet for this tutorial on excelfind.com. Link is in the description. We're gonna start with a quick recap and take a look at the different search modes we implemented for the dynamic data search box in part 1, because we're gonna start based on what we already implemented. If you just have watched the first part, you can easily skip that recap. Here we have our dynamic data search box, and it is currently filtering based on the name column of our data and generating these 3 different outputs, each using a slightly different implementation of the filter function. Now, to demonstrate you the difference between these search modes, let's search for a name. We type in the first name, and you see right there only the partial match search modes show the result we are looking for. For the exact match area, to show something, we have to enter the full name. And as you see, now it also displays the correct result. But only taking away one letter makes the exact match not displaying anything. Now, what is the difference between the 2 partial match search modes? It becomes visible when we take away the first name, because now the partial match still displays a result because it doesn't care at which index the search term is found in the text, while the partial left match is more strict and only displays values that begin with the search term. But how do the different formulas look for each of these search modes? For the exact match, it is pretty simple. We have the filter function that has 3 arguments. The first one is the return array, where we just select the whole data set without headers. Then the second argument is the condition for the filtering. And if we are just filtering for exact matches, we simply select the search column and set it equal to the search term. And then the last argument is the message if no match has been found. For the partial match mode, we have a slightly different filtering condition. Instead of just comparing the values in the search column directly with the search term, we use the search function within the isNumber function to determine for each row if the search term is somehow contained in the search column, without considering the exact position in the text. And for the more strict partial left match, we use the left function to compare the starting characters in our search column with the search term. Yeah, so that's it for the recap. And as I already mentioned, we are currently searching in the name column. And we have defined the return array and the name column by using absolute cell references. So A9 to C21 for the return array and A9 to A21 for the search column. That means if we want to change the search column to, let's say, the region column for all our filter formulas, we would have to do that manually by finding these A9 to A21s and replacing them with B9 to B21s. And then once we replace them, the search column is changed for all filter formulas, and when we search for a region, let's say Canada, you see now that works. But that is not a good way to do this, because it is such a high manual effort every single time we want to select a different search column, and that can be done much more elegant with a drop-down column selection. So let's do that. For the first technique, I simply duplicated the worksheet we had, then I visually expanded the search area up here, and I also decided to hide the partial match search mode areas for now, because it makes sense to learn this approach with the most simple example, which is the exact match search, and then just transfer this concept over to the more complex search modes. Up here we want to add a drop-down list where we can select the search column. for which we consider the name and region columns. For inserting a drop-down list, the cell has to be selected, and we then go to the Data tab, click on this symbol, and on Data Validation, and instead of allowing any value, we set this to List, and for the content of the list, we simply selected 2 header names of these columns. That creates this drop-down list where we can either select name or region. Let's have a look into our formula. The main problem here is that we use absolute cell references, and there is no way to reference some sort of column name in here. In order to be able to work with column names, we have to put our original data into a table. So let's do that. We quickly change the design. And we also change the name of this table to Data Table. And now, when we go into our formula and replace this absolute column reference by selecting the table's region column, you see, the reference now says Data Table and then in brackets region. So now we have the column's name included in this formula. Let's hit enter and quickly test if it still works. And yeah, it finds the match easily. Changing the search column now became much easier, because in the formula we simply have to replace region with name in the table column reference. And that works just fine. To do this correctly, let's also change the return array reference to the whole data table. This also has the advantage that we don't have to adjust the formula if we add new rows to the data. Now, the big question is, how can we make this formula dynamically refer to the value in our drop-down list? More precisely, how to keep the words data table and the brackets static in this formula, and the column name between the brackets dynamic as a cell reference. The Excel function we are looking for here is the indirect function. The indirect function transforms plain text into a valid Excel formula. So what we can do here is, we put the data table and the opening bracket into quotation marks, which makes them simple text. Then we use the AND symbol to concatenate it with another text fragment. Then we add the cell reference to our drop-down cell that has a column name as text in it. And then we add another AND symbol and add the closing brackets with quotation marks. And that is already it. Based on what column name we select in the drop-down list, this formula will now dynamically adjust. Let's test it. As you see, we have the name column selected, so let's enter a full name. And it finds the match. If we now change the search column to region, no match is found because there's no region called Alex Garcia. But if we now search for Canada, we get the correct result. Isn't that amazing? Now let's transfer this concept over to the other search modes. The concept stays exactly the same. All we have to do is, of course, replacing the return array with the data table reference, and then replace the absolute search column reference with this indirect expression where we reference the drop-down cell. A quick test proves we are currently searching in the region column, and if we change the search column to name and reduce the search term to C, we get all names that contain a C. Switching back to region again shows us all regions with a C, which is still only Canada. And for the partial left match formula, the adjustments are exactly the same. Putting in the data table reference for the return array and replacing the search column reference with the indirect expression. Beautiful. And the quick test proves that search mode now is also dependent on the selected search column. That is pretty amazing. This first technique is already a big improvement for the usability of this dynamic search box. Now, whenever we want to search in a different column, we can easily select it in this drop-down list. But what if you don't want to make a decision between your columns and instead search in multiple columns at once with only one dynamic search box? For that, we have to choose a different approach. For this second technique, I simply duplicated the worksheet that we have just created for technique number 1. And again, I hit the 2 partial match modes to show the technique with the most simple example. By the way, don't be confused, the data table in this worksheet cannot have the same exact name as in the previous worksheet, so now it is called, instead of data table 3. In general, I would always recommend to have your data table in a separate worksheet. I just left it in the active worksheet for all these examples to make the techniques easier to understand. Now, to filter based on multiple columns at once with only one search box, we cannot use this drop-down list anymore, because it's not the best tool for multi-selection. For that reason, we transform the cell back into a normal cell and split it into the 2 original cells. And then we rename this into search columns. Let's jump into our formula. Since we just removed the drop-down list, we don't need the indirect formula either. We have to replace it. Let's start this process from scratch. If we want to search in the name and region column at once, the intuitive way might look like just selecting both these table columns and set them equal to our search term, right? But doing it this way gives us a value error. That is because the include argument of the filter function expects one single boolean, so either true or false value for each row. But by selecting 2 search columns and therefore also comparing 2 values with the search term for each row, we also get an array with 2 boolean values per row side by side. That means if these 2 values differ, so for example one is true and the other one false, the filter function has no clear answer to whether return or ignore this row. For that reason, we have to find a way to combine these 2 values into one single and non-ambiguous value. To make this combined value become true, all it requires is that we get a true value for one of these columns. That means we only need one match in one of these columns. So what we're going to do is, we compare each column separately with the search term. Let's do some brackets around it. And then we simply add those 2 expressions up. So the comparison of the region row is now added to this first comparison with a plus. And that enables the search box to search in both columns at the same time. Let's test it. We're gonna search for Chris Miller, which is in the name column. And we find him. But just in the same manner, we can also search for Canada. And all rows with the region Canada are displayed. That's already pretty amazing. But that is just the first step, because I promised you to demonstrate how we can include and exclude columns for the search with one click by using checkboxes. For that, let's start by writing the column names in these cells up there. And in the neighboring cells, we put in boolean values. Let's take true for both at the beginning. We make the font a bit smaller, bold, and green. And then we're gonna include these boolean cell values as signal variables into the formula by multiplying them with the respective logical test. So we multiplied this value for the name column with the logical test for the name column. And in the same manner, we multiplied this value with the logical test for the region column. Now let's enter, for example, Canada. Right now, we are searching in the name and region column at once. But as soon as we set this one to false, the filter formula no longer searches in the region column, so there's no match found. And it's the same for the name column. If we enter Rob Wilson, we find it. But as soon as we set the name signal variable to false, no match is found. That means by changing these boolean values, we can now control which columns will be included as search columns. Now, to improve this process from a user experience perspective, we can insert checkboxes and connect them to these cells. For that, we go to the Developer tab, click on Insert, and under the ActiveX controls, we find the checkbox. So let's select it. And for now, we drag them over here. Let's right-click and edit the checkbox because we want to remove the text. Then we duplicate it. And now we right-click again and open the properties. Under linked cell, we simply type in the cell we want the checkbox to be linked to. In this case, it's K3. Then we do the same for the other checkbox and link it to the cell K4. To test it, let's leave the design mode. And now you see we have full control over these cells via the checkboxes. No need to type in the true or false values anymore. We turn on the design mode again so that we can place the checkboxes right on top of these cells, make them fit in there, and at the same time cover the underlying value. And the same for the second checkbox. Let's leave the design mode again and test if everything works fine. Currently, the name column is active. Now it's inactive. Works pretty good. And the region column can be included and excluded just as well. Beautiful! Transferring this now to the other two search modes only takes a small effort, since most of the work is already done. We only have to adjust the formulas accordingly. So we replace that indirect function with a single table column reference, put it into brackets, and multiply it with the signal variable. And then we add the same for the other column. Keep in mind that we always have to put these signal variables K3 and K4 on the outside of any formula that we use within this include argument. Once we adjusted the filter formula accordingly, we hit enter and test it just by typing the character C. Now this is pretty awesome because as you see now every row is displayed that either contains text with a C in the name or the region column. If we now uncheck the name column, only region results with C are displayed. And also the other way around. If we have the name column checked and uncheck the region column, only rows with a C somewhere in the name are displayed. For the partial left match, it is pretty much the same. Again, we replace the indirect function with a simple table column reference. Multiply it with K3 and put the logical test into brackets. And then add the same with K4 and the logical test for the region table column. Now, as you see, for this search mode, we now only get rows displayed that have the letter C either as the beginning of the name or as the beginning of the region. Excluding the name column from the search leaves us only with Canada, while only excluding the region column leaves us with Chris and Christina. Beautiful! What a powerful technique for searching through data in real time and multiple columns at once. The final technique I'm going to show you is for use cases in which you need to search for one search term in one column and for another search term in another column at the same time. Obviously, this becomes more relevant the bigger your dataset is. Again, I duplicated the previous worksheet and want to focus on the most simple search mode at the beginning. First of all, we're going to get rid of all these cells over here. Because now the question is no longer if we want to include one or the other column. Now we always want to include each column for which we create a search box. What we're going to add now is another search box. So let's copy that description down here and rename these labels to make them related to the column. In the same manner, we also duplicate that search box, and what's important here is that we change the linked cell of this second search box to F4, which is the underlying cell of this second search box. Now that we got our two separate search boxes, we can leave the developer design mode and take a look at the filter formula. We still have these signal variables K3 and K4 in there, but we don't need them anymore as we want both logical tests to be active at any time. So we are left with two logical tests that are combined with a plus symbol. For the remaining expression, the first thing to adjust is we now want to compare the region column against F4, which is the linked cell of our second search box. So let's change that. And currently the results of both these logical tests are added up. But actually we want them to depend on each other, which means for a row, both logical tests have to be true to have the row displayed with the filter function. That's why we need to change this addition into a simple multiplication. And that's how easy it is. For the exact match search, we have to type in the full name and the full region. And you see we only get a result here if both values are found in one row. Of course, this will be a little more elegant with the partial match. So let's make the same changes for this formula. We also get rid of K3 and K4. Change the addition into a multiplication. And for the second logical test, we change F3 into F4. There we go. If we now type in the letter R for name, the list is filtered down to all rows in which the name contains an R at some position. If we then go to the region search box and type in a U, now the region column is also filtered down to all regions that contain a U at some position. And by typing in one additional letter in both search boxes, we filter out more and more rows. Awesome! For the more strict partial left match search, we do the same adjustments, which are removing K3 and K4, changing the plus into multiplication, and be careful, here we have to replace F3 by F4 at two places, once in the length formula and once on the right side of the logical test. Let's enter an R for the name and a U for the region. And now you see, since this search mode is more strict and only matches the beginning of the words, now with two separate search boxes implemented, it is enough to only have one letter in each search box to strictly filter down to this one single row. If we take away that U, there is no filtering for the region anymore, and we can see the only two names in the dataset displayed that start with the letter R. The same happens if we type in C for the name and E for the region. The only reason that the partial match mode and the partial left match mode display the same result here is that there is no other entry in the data that contains a name and a region with these respective letters at any position. In a bigger dataset, the output of these two search modes would be different for sure. Now, for this whole tutorial, we had a look at the different search modes side by side for each implementation. Just like in part 1, I want to demonstrate to you how it looks if you combine these search modes into one result area and make the user select the search mode via a drop-down list. Here we have it for the first technique. So now we basically have two drop-down lists, one for the search mode and one for the search column. The search mode drop-down selection is implemented using the if-as function. If you haven't watched part 1, I have explained it there. It is pretty simple. At the moment we search in the name column in partial match mode, we can change that to partial left match or exact match. And of course we can also change the search column. For the multi-column search with only one single search box, the combined implementation looks like this. Currently, we have the partial search mode selected and include both columns as search columns. So if we type in a C, all rows are displayed that either contain a C in the name or the region. If we change it to partial left match, it is reduced to rows with either names or regions that begin with the letter C. And if we now exclude the name column from the search, only regions starting with letter C are displayed. And the other way around, it works just as well. For the last technique with multiple search boxes, I rearranged the position of the search box, not a big deal. At the moment we are in partial match search mode, so let's type in a C and a U. So we get all rows that contain a C in the name and at the same time a U in the region with no respect to the character position of the match. And if we change it to partial left match mode, the character position is considered now, so we are left with only a single row that meets these strict conditions. Perfect. That's it for this tutorial. I hope you learned a lot and that you can apply these techniques for dynamic data search boxes to your own projects to make searching and filtering big amounts of data a lot easier and elegant in the future. The worksheet for this tutorial is available for download on excelfind.com. Link is in the description. And if you enjoyed this tutorial, don't forget to subscribe and give a thumbs up. I wish you a great day and see you next time. Cheers!